What if the most important grave in English history was underneath a parking lot in Leicester? Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, buried in haste, and lost for 500 years. Shakespeare made him a monster. Tudor propaganda erased his grave, and history moved on until 2012, when a team from the University of Leicester cut through the asphalt and found him. But the DNA they extracted didn't just confirm his identity. It broke a royal bloodline that 6 centuries of monarchy were built on. The excavation began in August 2012. Philippa Langley, a screenwriter and Richard enthusiast, had spent years lobbying for the dig. On the first day of trenching, they found human remains, a skeleton with severe scoliosis of the spine, injuries consistent with medieval battle. The skull showed 2 fatal wounds. A large blade had sliced away a portion of the base. A second weapon had penetrated through to the inner surface. 10 wounds total across the skeleton, 8 to the skull, none to the arms or hands, suggesting he'd lost his helmet but was still fighting. The injuries matched contemporary accounts of Bosworth. Richard was unhorsed, surrounded, and cut down. His body was stripped and paraded through Leicester. But archaeology can only take you so far. The skeleton matched the description. The location matched the historical record. It was consistent with Richard. Consistent isn't confirmed. For that, they needed the DNA. The first piece of evidence came from the maternal line. Mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child, unchanged across generations. Geneticist Turi King at Leicester traced Richard's maternal line forward through 5 centuries of documented female descent. She found 2 living descendants, Michael Ibsen, a Canadian-born furniture maker, and Wendy Duldig, an Australian woman. Both carried an unbroken female line back to Richard's sister, Anne of York. The mitochondrial DNA matched. Haplogroup J1C2C, a relatively rare lineage. The skeleton's maternal line was consistent with the Plantagenet royal family. Combined with the archaeological evidence, the scoliosis, the battle wounds, the Greyfriars location, the identification was all but certain. Richard III had been found, 5 centuries after his death, under a car park in the English Midlands. Case closed. Except the case wasn't closed, because King's team had also tested the Y chromosome, the paternal line. And that is where everything fell apart. Richard's Y chromosome should have matched his patrilineal descendants, men connected to him through an unbroken chain of fathers and sons stretching back to Edward III. Edward III fathered Richard's direct male line ancestor. Every man in that chain should share the same Y chromosome, father to son, unchanged. Richard carried haplogroup G. His supposed patrilineal descendants carried haplogroup R1b. They didn't match. Somewhere in the chain between Edward III and the modern descendants, a paternity event had occurred. A break, an infidelity. At least one man in the official royal line was not the biological son of his official father. The third piece of evidence put a number on the problem. King's team calculated the odds. Across 19 generations between Edward III and the modern descendants, at a historical false paternity rate of 1 to 2%, per generation, there is a 16 to 26% chance of at least one break. Not improbable, not even unlikely. Over 5 centuries and 19 generations, a break was almost expected, but the implications were unprecedented. If the break occurred before Richard, between Edward III and Richard III, then the man wearing the crown may not have been the biological heir. If it occurred after Richard, in the line of modern descendants, then the break has no bearing on medieval legitimacy. It simply means a Tudor or post-Tudor descendant had a different biological father than the records claim. The team couldn't determine which scenario was correct. The Y chromosome data only proves a break occurred, not when, not where, not who. The fourth piece of evidence came from expanding the search, because one Y chromosome mismatch could be explained away. Multiple mismatches could not. King's team tested 5 living patrilineal descendants of Edward III through a completely different branch. The line of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, through the Beaufort family to the Dukes of Somerset. The 5 Somerset descendants matched each other. All carried R1b, but they didn't match Richard's G haplogroup. 2 branches of the same royal family, 2 different Y chromosomes, At least one false paternity event somewhere in the Plantagenet line. The crown of England, passed from father to son for 3 centuries, was at some point passed from a man who wasn't the biological father to a son who wasn't the biological heir. The 5th piece of evidence takes the story further into what this means for every royal succession that followed. Henry VII defeated Richard at Bosworth and founded the Tudor dynasty. His claim to the throne was weak by blood. It ran through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, from John of Gaunt's legitimized but originally illegitimate line. If the Y chromosome break occurred in the Beaufort line, which the Somerset descendants represent, then Henry VII's already tenuous biological connection to royal blood becomes even thinner. But here is what matters. It didn't matter then, and it doesn't matter now, because medieval kingship wasn't purely about biological descent. It was about power, conquest, and Parliament's recognition. Henry took the crown by force. Parliament ratified it. The biological question was irrelevant then, but it is fascinating now. But here is the twist. The Y chromosome break isn't the scandal everyone reported. It is actually the norm. Historical false paternity rates across European populations consistently measure between 1% and 2% per generation. Some studies estimate higher for medieval aristocracy, where political marriages and prolonged royal absences were standard. In a world where kings campaigned abroad for years, where queens were left to govern alone, where dynastic alliances demanded heirs at any cost, the real surprise would be 0 breaks across 19 generations. The Plantagenet break isn't evidence of a unique scandal. It is evidence that royal bloodlines work exactly like every other human lineage, imperfectly, humanly, with the same infidelities, the same secrets, the same gaps between official record and biological reality that exist in every family tree on Earth. And the Plantagenets aren't alone. Every royal house in Europe that has been genetically tested shows anomalies. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, Napoleon's Bonapartes. Wherever geneticists look, the official pedigree and the molecular record diverge. The real twist isn't that the Plantagenet line broke. It is that we expected it not to. We built nations on the myth of unbroken lineage. DNA simply pointed out it was always a myth. The burial itself tells a story the DNA can't. Richard was buried in the choir of the Greyfriars Church, a Franciscan friary dissolved by Henry VIII in 1538. The grave was too short. His body had been crammed in, head propped against one end. No coffin, no shroud. Hands positioned in a way that suggests they may have been tied. The last Plantagenet king, thrown into a hole barely big enough for his body by the men who killed him. Post-mortem wounds, including a blade thrust through the pelvis, suggest his body was mutilated after death. Humiliation injuries inflicted on a corpse. The second case study used his bones to reconstruct his life in chemical detail. Stable isotope analysis of his teeth, femur, and rib told a 3-part story. Childhood in Eastern England, adolescence with increasing protein intake, and his final years dramatically elevated in both protein and oxygen-18 isotope values. His final 2 years showed a spike consistent with feasting and heavy wine consumption. A king living at the height of royal excess, right before everything ended at Bosworth. The chemistry of his bones read like a biography: modest childhood, rising status, royal indulgence, violent death. The third case study confronts the question everyone dances around. What does the Y chromosome break actually mean for the modern monarchy? The honest answer is nothing. The English crown has changed hands by conquest, parliamentary act, and religious upheaval multiple times since Richard's death. Henry VII took it by force. Henry VIII broke with Rome to secure it. Parliament invited William of Orange to claim it. The Act of Settlement in 1701 determined succession by religion, not strict blood priority. The modern monarchy's legitimacy rests on parliamentary statute, not Y chromosome continuity. Biology was never the sole basis, and DNA doesn't change the law. But what the DNA does reveal is something more interesting than a succession crisis. It reveals that the mythology of blood right, the divine chain of fathers and sons, was always a political fiction enforced by power, not by nature. 3 case studies: a brutal burial, a chemical biography, and a crown that was never purely genetic. The genetic record doesn't delegitimize any king. It delegitimizes the idea that kingship was ever purely about blood. Richard III fought and died for a crown. His Y chromosome may not have entitled him to hold. Henry VII won that crown by killing him, and his biological connection to royalty was thinner still. Power made kings. DNA just watches. So what does Richard's DNA actually tell us? More than any headline captured, it tells us he was real, not Shakespeare's villain, not Tudor propaganda. A man with a curved spine who fought in the front lines at Bosworth and died with 8 wounds to his skull. It tells us the maternal line held. His mitochondrial DNA confirmed his identity beyond reasonable doubt. And it tells us the paternal line broke, somewhere across 5 centuries. The official record and biological reality parted ways. Not a scandal. A statistical inevitability made visible by technology that didn't exist when the consequences mattered. He was reburied in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, with full honors, a state ceremony for a king whose body had lain under tarmac for 5 centuries. The last Plantagenet, found by a screenwriter, identified by a geneticist, reburied by a nation that had spent 500 years pretending he didn't matter. Crowns are inherited. DNA is not always a face rebuilt from bones, a lineage broken by biology, a king who was lost and found and complicated in equal measure. His DNA didn't diminish him, it humanized him. The evidence file is complete, 5 independent lines of investigation. Identity confirmed, lineage complicated, not the monster of Shakespeare, not the martyr of the Ricardians, just a man whose bones told a truth his dynasty never could. And a reminder that the ground beneath our feet holds more history than any book ever written. But Richard isn't the only royal whose DNA told a story the monarchy didn't authorize. Across Europe, cathedral crypts and royal tombs are being opened for the first time in centuries, and the deeper researchers dig into the bones of kings, the more the clean lines of succession dissolve. If one Y chromosome can break a dynasty, what happens when we test them all? Which throne fractures next? Which national founding myth doesn't survive the sequencer? Ancient DNA technology improves every year. The bones aren't going anywhere. The questions are only multiplying. If this investigation changed what you thought you knew, subscribe. Every case in this series follows the same rule. Start with the textbook. Follow the DNA, and let the molecules speak for themselves. Richard's dynasty lasted 3 centuries. His Y chromosome didn't survive the journey. All sources and peer-reviewed references are linked in the description below. The question isn't whether kings are legitimate. It is whether legitimacy was ever written in blood. And that is a question every crown in Europe is still afraid to answer.